My name's Allison Laubach. I'm a PhD student in the Ocean Sciences department, and I'm happy to be talking to you about the work I've done as part of the CSP Designated Emphasis program. This is going to be a slightly different style of project from the ones we've seen so far today. I'm going to be looking at the impact of a research program using citation networks. So the question I'm going to be focusing on today is, how has the GeoTraces program changed the trace element research landscape? So to unpack that, I'm first going to talk to you about what trace elements are in the ocean and why it's important to measure them and also difficult to measure them. I'll introduce the GeoTraces program, what that is, and the activities it does. Then we'll get into a citation network of articles published through affiliation with the GeoTraces program and look at the impact the program has had on training students and especially international capacity building to do this type of research. So first, we're going to jump into a brief overview of trace elements. Trace elements are elements that are naturally occurring in very low concentrations in the ocean. They're things like iron and zinc, but also things you might think of as kind of bad, like mercury and lead. To focus in on one of these elements and explain how low these concentrations are in the ocean, I want you to think about iron for a second and to think of a paperclip. The concentration of iron that you might expect to see in the ocean is equivalent to dissolving that paperclip in about 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So very low concentrations, but also it's important that we are researching trace elements because they are powerful tools for understanding all aspects of the ocean. For example, they can tell us about ocean circulation, so how water is moving around in the ocean, the carbon cycle, and how well the ocean can absorb CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere and store it away. So they also tell us a lot about climate change in the past and the future. They can also tell us about biological productivity, so when and where things can be growing in the ocean, and other general indicators of ocean health. Unfortunately, trace elements are very challenging to measure. So I'm going to walk you through some of those challenges in sort of a rapid style right now. The first one is that to measure them, you have to go collect them out in the ocean. So you first need access to a ship. Research vessel ship time is very expensive, and your access to these ships is going to be based on where you work. So the nation or institution you're working for may or may not have access to one of these types of ships. Once you get a ship, you have to go get on it out in the ocean, but the ship itself is made of metal and is dirty. So to measure these really low natural concentrations without contamination, you need specialized equipment and trained staff on the ship. And then once you collect your sample, you need to process it immediately. So you need to set up an entire laboratory inside of the ship that also isn't contaminated by the metal of the ship. And you need to have trained scientists available 24/7 on the ship to do this processing. Once you get it back to your lab, you need specialized equipment and high precision instruments to make these types of measurements to do this type of research. All of this means that trace element research is expensive, time and labor intensive, prone to contamination, and requires a lot of specialized training, high precision technology, and institutional access. To look at how the international community has been dealing with those challenges, we're going to talk about the GeoTraces program. The GeoTraces program began in around 2004 because at the time, trace element research in the ocean was done by only a handful of people. And some scientists who were working on it realized that if we ever wanted to really understand what was going on in the ocean using these trace elements, we were really going to need to expand our efforts and get as many people working on it as possible. So a lot of that work was led by Bob Anderson and Catherine Jondell. And the GeoTraces program was formed under the purview of SCORE, which is an International Science Council Committee on Oceanic Research. GeoTraces has a science mission, which is to essentially do a better job at understanding trace elements in the ocean. But it also has capacity building goals. So their goals are that every nation carrying out ocean research would have the capability to measure trace elements and have access to trace metal sampling systems, and to establish a program where experienced scientists can share their knowledge and help new labs build up their ability to do this type of research. The structure of the GeoTraces program is sort of in two parts here. One has the training activities, which are led by the International Project Office based in Toulouse, France. I was very lucky to get to intern with them over the summer, and this project is done in conjunction with the International Project Office, or IPO. The sort of scientific guidance is done by the Scientific Steering Committee, which currently is led by scientists from 16 different nations listed here. So the GeoTraces program since 2004 has done a lot of really important work for trace element research. So on the science side, they've established these long-term science plans with goals and areas of focus. And they also have really robust systems for ensuring that the data produced through the GeoTraces program is really high quality. For capacity building, they've hosted joint international research cruises or helped set them up, summer schools to train graduate students, and they've published these open access cookbooks, which are basically do-it-yourself guides to sampling trace elements. And they've provided really crucial mentorship where scientists who have already dealt with the hassle of setting up a system to do this type of work go to labs that want to be able to do it and help get a system up and running. So back to our main question, how has this program changed the trace element research landscape? We're going to look at this in three different ways. First, we're going to look at what the research network looked like before and after the GeoTraces program. And then we're going to see if the program has successfully trained new researchers and what impact it has had on international capacity. So thinking about that first question, we're going to be looking at citation networks. So I'm using a citation database, which is a database of journal articles and student thesis documents produced through work in the GeoTraces program. It includes more than 2,200 journal articles, more than 280 student thesis documents, and it represents more than 5,000 researchers around the world whose work has been cited more than 70,000 times. So what was the research network like before, during, and at the end of the GeoTraces program? I'm going to show you some network visualizations. So a little run through on how those work. Each node on the diagram is a researcher, and they are connected to other researchers with lines that represent times when they have co-authored papers together. Nodes that are closer together are researchers that collaborate more frequently, and nodes that are further apart are researchers that collaborate less often. So we get to see this really crazy diagram of the research network. This has thousands of researchers on it and represents all of the trace element research done through the GeoTraces program from 2004 to 2024. This is a lot to look at, so we're going to break it down to see what we can learn about how the network has changed through time. First, we can look at the network early in the GeoTraces program, and we see that it looks very different. It's scattered, there are fewer researchers represented here, fewer connections, and there are subgroups that are not all connected to each other. If we compare that to the last few years of the research network, we can see that there are many more researchers. There's sort of a dense cluster in the middle of highly collaborative work, and then slightly less connected work around the edges. These observations fit with our knowledge of the number of authors present in the network over time, So this is just a graph showing time on the x-axis. And as we move through the GeoTraces program, we see that the number of authors present in the network goes up over time, with big jumps happening after 2010, 2012, and continuing to the present. We can also look at the structure of the research network to understand how information is moving between people and how collaborations are happening within the network. So I'm going to go through a couple of metrics for looking at that. The first one is clustering. So to explain that, imagine you are a researcher and you are this top circle here, and you have people that you work with. Clustering shows you the odds that your collaborators also collaborate with each other. So it's a probability that ranges from 0 to 1. High average clustering in a network means that there's really efficient local information exchange. Because if you think of this as a network of your friends, for example, if your friends are also friends with each other, you don't have to pass information back and forth. They can speak directly to each other. But it could also indicate a level of clickiness or sort of sticking to your own small group. So we can look at how this clustering has worked in the GeoTraces network over time. So here's a graph. X-axis again is time, and we're looking at this clustering, and we see all of the values are very high, so 90% chance that your collaborators will also work with each other. But in the beginning, it's very, very high, and then it drops down at the beginning of the GeoTraces program, where I think this is representing the network becoming less clicky, and then a pretty consistent level of clustering throughout the rest of the program. We can also look at something called betweenness. So again, if you are this researcher here who's outlined in bold, betweenness represents how likely you are to be a link between two groups. If, as an individual, you have a high level of betweenness, you can kind of be thought of as an information broker in the network. So you have a lot of power and influence because you are the connection that passes information between different groups. And we can look at betweenness in this network over time as well. So at the beginning, and with the jump in 2012, we see high levels of betweenness in the network, representing the emergence of powerful bridge people. So these people who are linking different groups together. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to link groups together. Ideally, more than one person is doing it, but it starts with one person. And then as the network matures, we have many smaller bridges linking people together as we see the betweenness sort of levels off. So if we think of our question, what has the network looked like before, during, and after the GeoTraces program? Before the GeoTraces program, this research network was fragmented and sparse. When the program began, it rapidly integrated with more connections being made, more authors in the network, and the emergence of these bridge authors connecting groups together. And as the program has matured, the network is more collaborative and modular with a large core of highly connected authors and specialized subgroups with multiple bridges between them. So now that we know that our network has been growing, we can look at some of the impacts of the GeoTraces network. We're first going to look at if the program has successfully trained new researchers, and we're going to do that by focusing on the student thesis documents in the data set. So using these thesis documents, I'm able to sort of tag these researchers as people that I know for sure were students in the program. And I can also know the year that they graduated, which means I can track where they are in the network after they graduate from grad school. As a note, this doesn't include current students. So for example, I don't count as a student in this data set because I don't have a thesis out yet. So I can't be tagged and followed through time. Here's an overview of the 282 former students in the network. So this x-axis is years since their thesis was out. So this is years out of grad school. And we can see that most of the authors are sort of less than 10 years out of grad school, which we would call an early career scientist. By following these students through the network, can also say that 56% of the students stay in the network after they graduate. So they keep doing this type of research or collaborating on this type of research after they're through with grad school. Former students are less than 5% of the total authors represented in this data set, but they have uh, co-authorship on about a quarter of all the publications. So even though they're a small subset of authors, they have a really high influence in the research. We can also see this by looking at betweenness again. So on the x-axis is years since graduating, and I have it broken into categories of student, early career, and later career. And we can see that over time, former students become more and more influential in the network and eventually are actually some of the most influential people in the network. Finally, we can address what impact the program has had on international capacity. So at the beginning of the GeoTraces program, this data set has authors from less than 20 countries represented in it. By the end, we now have authors from more than 80 countries represented. And because we have these citation metrics, we can map the spread of research over time, which I'm going to show you now on a different window if I can get to it without hiding this. There we go. Okay, can we see this? Great, okay. So this is a map where countries are going to appear during the year. So each frame is a year in the research network, and countries are going to appear during the first year when an author from that country publishes something in the GeoTraces network. And the country color gets darker the more authors are represented in the country. So this is now in 2025, and we can see that the number of nations and the spread of nations around the globe has expanded a lot through the GeoTraces program, although there are still some important gaps. Overall, that leads us to the conclusion that the GeoTraces program has expanded and connected the trace element research community. Students trained through the program have become influential trace element researchers, and the international trace element research capacity has expanded to 4 times as many countries compared to before the GeoTraces program. And with that, I would like to thank Elena at the GeoTraces project office, who is the executive officer there and who I worked with last summer, SCORE and the NSF for supporting the GeoTraces program financially, Greg Cutter, who has for years been dedicated to international capacity development in this area, Rafe Cadella and Phoebe Lamb, my advisors for this project, the NSF Intern Award, which provides funding for students on a NSF research grant to go work outside of academia as an intern, and the CSP DE program. I did my coursework for the DE program in 2020, and it has really changed the way that I look at my research and my options going forward for ways that I can impact ocean research and also ocean health and policy. So I'm really grateful to be part of this program.